English translation. 641st Contact Wednesday, the 6th of January 2016, 21:47 hours.
Hello, Ptah, my son. Greetings and welcome. Actually, I was not expecting you until tomorrow afternoon for correction and then for a visit.
Greetings to you too, Edward, dear father, and thank you for your welcome. My coming here at this time is because I returned 2 hours ago with Anjana and Florena, after which I still had some work to do with them, so I now use the time to see you.
Oh well, then what about tomorrow's correction work?
I will not be present, so Anjana will do the correction work.
Fine, but I would like to ask you about the state of the world's population, because in the last 2 weeks I've been asked about it several times.
Our records on the 31st of December 2015 at exactly midnight showed a result of 8,634,006,014 Earth humans.
I would be interested to know how you make your notes and calculate the final result.
Our recordings are made by an automatic registration every second from 0 o'clock hours on the 1st of January during the following 365 days until 0 o'clock hours on the 31st of December. The automatic registration is carried out by appropriate equipment, which on the one hand records all deaths and all births, but on the other hand also simultaneously calculates the total population resulting from dying and birth processes.
Describing these apparatuses might be a little complicated, might it not?
This is in fact the case, for it is a series of highly developed ultrafine techniques which are not even unparalleled on Earth in their beginnings, but which are described theoretically in science fiction novels and presented visually in science fiction films.
Yes, I know this from the Enterprise and Star Trek movies, for example, but in this respect only human life forms on planets etc. can be recognized, but no person-specific registrations of entire planet populations as you can do.
For this technology, the earthly researchers, constructors, physicists, and scientists first need the basic ideas and findings that still have to be made. But there's still a long way to go.
I can imagine. Yesterday on television I saw a program about the so-called Veronica welding cloth, which we already talked about in the 418th Contact conversation on the 6th of May 2006, Plejadisch-Plejarenische Kontaktberichte, Volume 10, page 413, about which you said that the whole thing was nonsense. The aforementioned alleged sweat cloth, which is supposed to contain the image of Emmanuel alias Jesus, exists in several copies and of course as alleged original also in the Vatican, but also as original in the Church of Manopello, where it is known as Volto Santo of Manopello. It is an icon on a wafer-thin cloth of mussel silk that is revered as a relic in the small Italian town of Manopello in Abruzzo. The cloth became famous because of the mysteriousness of its origin, its material, and the face on it. The wafer-thin cloth consists of byssos or mussel silk, which is also called sea silk. The following can be found on the internet. The Veronica Sudarium, sweat cloth, is an object of Christian legend. According to Christian tradition, Veronica gave her cloth to Jesus of Nazareth on his way to Golgotha to wipe sweat and blood off his face. The face of Jesus is said to have been miraculously imprinted on the sweat cloth as a so-called Veronica image. Another internet note states the following: the Church Santuario del Volto Santo in Manopello. The Veil of Manopello, also known as Volto Santo of Manopello, is an icon on a wafer-thin cloth that is revered as a relic in the small Italian town of Manopello in Abruzzo. In recent years, the scarf has become famous for the mysteriousness of its origin, its material, and the face on it. Furthermore, the following can be found on the internet about the Veronica welding cloth. The Volto Santo Italian Holy Face is a 17.5 centimeters wide and 24 centimeters high veil that has been kept in Manopello since the 17th century in the Capuchin church Santuario del Volto Santo on the Tarigni Hill outside the city. Since the 1960s, the cloth has been shown above the altar in a double-sided glazed reliquary from the early 18th century. Previously, the reliquary was in a dark side chapel in which the cloth was barely recognizable to the viewer. It has not been taken out of its scope for centuries, and has so far only been studied with the aid of microscopes, infrared and ultraviolet light, and Raman spectroscopy. The carrier material may be a fabric made of byssus, also known as mussel silk, a substance obtained from the adhesive threads of the noble mussels living in the Mediterranean. In antiquity and the Middle Ages, this fabric was considered to be one of the most precious of all. The craft of byssus production is almost extinct today, which is why it is difficult to judge the possibilities of its processing. Shell silk is not considered to be paintable and only easily dyeable. The two upper triangular gussets are made of a different material, probably silk, and were apparently added later. The face can be seen equally from both sides due to the fineness of the cloth. The veil shows the face of a man with long hair, beard, open eyes, and slightly open mouth. Reddish spots are visible on the face, interpreted by some as wounds caused by torture or scourge. The face on the veil iconographically shows a certain proximity to the Tuscan pre-Renaissance and early Renaissance, but it is so untypical that it cannot be clearly assigned to an art historical epoch or school. The stylized facial features could be based on the painter's lack of expressiveness or on a conscious artistic decision. It is noteworthy that the veil of Manopello, like the Shroud of Turin, seems to be unique. Art history does not know any similar portrait. In artificial light, it looks as if it had been painted. In natural light, on the other hand, it is almost completely transparent. In changing light incidence, on the other hand, it appears vivid and alive. The colors of the veil change between different shades of gold, bronze, brown, and red, similar to the colors on a butterfly wing. While the portrait on the Turin shroud can actually only really be recognized as a photographic negative, the face on the veil has a positive effect. In the meantime, however, previously inexplicable photographic negative properties of the convex-concave reversal have also been determined. And with regard to the mussel silk itself, the following is further explained on the internet. Byssus, Byssos Greek, bousos, refers to three different things. Byssus in the sense of mussel silk is a name for the secretion from the foot glands of various species of mussels. The individual secretions of several glands in the foot of the mussels mainly form phenolic proteins, which are united to adhesive threads and harden. While many mussel species produce byssus only as young mussels, this secretion can last for life in others. Well-known examples of mussels with byssus threads are the mussels, which attach themselves to the structures of the surf zone with the byssus threads and can loosen these again in poor environmental conditions, and the fig mussels, which spin entire nets of byssus threads and thus fix foreign bodies. Byssus also refers to fibers made of silk, cotton, or flax from which fine fabrics have been produced. Byssus used to be a non-taxonomic collective name for molds with a fibrous structure that were classified as Hyphomycetes demati. This, then, with regard to the mussel silk and the Veronica image, which, as you have said, is absurd, precisely with regard to the assertion that the image represents the face of Emmanuel and Jesus respectively. Whose face is depicted on this picture of mussel silk? That is one question. The second of which refers to what you once privately mentioned, that the name Veronica was invented in relation to the woman who is said to have touched Emmanuel's face with the sweat scarf.
You seem to have misunderstood me or forgotten what I really said, because I did not say that the name Veronica was invented, but the person Veronica, because this woman never existed. We've clearly clarified that. So in principle, we must say that there was neither this invented Veronica nor any other woman who gave Emmanuel one of the several so-called sweat cloths or touched his face with one of them. Even when he was unconscious in the tomb, no such cloth was laid on his face. The origin of the picture, which is supposed to be traced back to a woman named Veronica, who neither existed nor Emmanuel handed in or put on a so-called sweat scarf, as is traditionally claimed to be an invention, goes back to a painter named Cecilia, who lived in central Italy in the Tuscany region, which corresponds to today's Tuscany. This woman made the face of her husband Marcellinus on a shell silk scarf which she had received from Sicily. and which was bought only a few years after its completion by a Catholic priest named Fufetius, who called it the image of Christ. I do not know what happened to them, except that they were used to make images and were admitted to church circles. That is what our notes make clear, but unfortunately not more.
Thanks. That will do for an answer. Then I want to say a few things that cross my mind about the New Year's Eve event in Cologne, where many women have been sexually harassed and even raped by a large number of men on the Bahnhofplatz, without the police having done anything useful against it. Sexual violence against women and girls has been present since time immemorial, because women and girls have always been sexually harassed, abused, not only in lonely fields, dark paths and streets, in underground garages, woods and everywhere else, but also in marriage and in relationships of friends and acquaintances, etc. Of course, children, boys and girls who have been sexually abused by pedophiles since time immemorial are also sexually raped. But here I will only talk about women and girls. And in many cases, sexually abused women are just as reluctant to report this to the authorities or the police as are young girls who are sexually abused by friends, strangers, or even their own father. But in general, I want to talk about the fact that many young and older, even older women, are afraid to go home alone in the dark, or even in broad daylight, or simply on the streets and paths. This is because, even in daylight and in the presence of many people, they are attacked, mistreated, sexually harassed, or possibly even raped by many people, without the all-seeing passers-by intervening out of cowardice or indifference. Since ancient times, many women have experienced sexual violence and must continue to do so today. But what happened in Cologne at the turn of the year is only a fact that is spreading more and more, as is the case in India in particular, where young and older women are sexually raped and then even murdered by men's groups. I experienced this already in the 1960s, when I lived in India and was confronted with such cases. This scared the women there as much as it did many of them in recent times, and today also throughout Europe as a result of the New Year events in Cologne with regard to the mass sexual assaults on women. And the fear is absolutely justified, because with the increase of the overpopulation, where the number of men becomes more and more predominant, because more boys than girls are born, the lack of women becomes bigger and bigger. This is particularly the case in China, but the consequence is that women and girls are increasingly attacked and sexually abused by men who want to satisfy their sexual urges uncontrollably. But this is not only the case in China, but also throughout Europe, the USA, Asia, Africa, and South America. We too have talked about these things many times in our private lives, which is why I am quite well informed about what is happening around the world in this regard. And if I think that the new state of investigation after the attacks in Cologne is quite lax and the police there try to talk their way out, then it can be foreseen what lax consequences the events will have for future police operations. The sexual mass attacks on women on New Year's Eve in Cologne are just another harbinger of what will happen in the future, because the growth of overpopulation will expand the whole thing. So it will only have been the beginning of the fact that in the future, small groups or a large number of men will hunt women, as is the case in India, where only lax attempts are made to become master of evil. And that many such cases are not punished is often due to the fact that sexually raped girls and women are ashamed to report their torturers and rapists to the police. Only when a girl or woman is also killed as a result of violent sexual assault or rape does the whole thing become known and lead to police and judicial measures. A fact that also arises in marriages and friendships, where women and girls are sexually abused and also beaten up and maybe even killed. Such reports and pictures haunt many newspapers and journals and are also broadcast on television and radio, as is also the case with those incidents that took place on the station forecourt of Cologne. They are stories of violence and danger, and the question arises as to where the women's fear comes from. But this question can be answered by the fact that the fear does not come from going home at night or every day, walking in the woods or fields, going to a disco or the cinema, or entering a dark underground garage, but from a sexy man, or a group of men, who is brutally and violently out for sexual rape. And it is such rapist creatures, who uncontrollably exercise their sexual fantasies and sex-loving instincts against girls and women with malevolent violence, who attack them, physically and psychically abuse and cattle rape them, that turn the entire righteous male world into monsters in the eyes of countless women and degrade it to monsters. And the truth is that many women and girls only go their ways day and night in fear, are afraid of darkness, or constantly fear that their bosom, buttocks, skirts, or panties will be grabbed by lewd man's hands. Many are also seized by fear when they are surrounded by groups or masses of people because they cannot escape in these lewd sexual touches. On the other hand, many girls and women are afraid of criminal charges for sexual assault because the suspect does not have to fear arrest and can strike again. The whole thing is connected with the fact that the women or girls fear that the sex lovers or rapists will respond even more with new sexual assaults, which can then also result in revenge in the form of malicious violence. And this is in fact possible due to lax legislation and inadequate police competences and measures. Consequently, due to lax and inadequate legislation, it can only be intervened when something worse happens. It is effective that sexual violence and experiencing possible sexual violence is present in countless women and girls, because it is the fact of rape and other sexual assaults that is repeatedly reported in the media, such as television, journals, radio, and newspapers. Consequently, the whole is quite an everyday life experience. The fact that it is precisely the events in Cologne that make this subliminal knowledge in girls and women even more active and alive is only a natural consequence. Such sexual assaults have existed in all countries since time immemorial, as I already mentioned, but what happened in the night in Cologne also happened at the Oktoberfest, for example. But much larger mass rapes of women and girls resulted in all the wars that rolled over the earth. The fact is that in all the wars that have ever taken place since time immemorial, girls and women have always been the ones to suffer because they have always been sexually raped with evil violence and coercion. Many of them were also killed afterwards as used goods. In the Second World War, for example, more than 200,000 Chinese women and girls were forced into Japanese army brothels and brutally and mercilessly raped for years. As far as the extent of sexual assaults is concerned, however, it is new in Europe outside the scope of warlike acts, because until now such incidents in Europe have only occurred in wars, but this fact is still concealed by all warring states, as is the fact of the mass rape of women and girls by the Bonaparte army, the Crusaders, the Allies and the Nazi army, etc. Eyewitnesses and victims of the mass of men in Cologne who attacked the girls and women reported that, in terms of appearance, mostly North African or Arab men had been involved in the whole thing. To what extent this was actually the case, I don't know, but if it was the case, then it must be the refugee madness of the German Chancellor Merkel. I come to this conclusion because in Germany, integrated and naturalized people from foreign countries are unlikely to let themselves be carried away into such an act, unless they would be carried away by others, which can be just as likely as the fact that people of pure German descent were involved in this disaster. Well, the idea that a woman or a girl is attacked and raped by a man she does not know or by a group of men is very widespread, because this actually happens every day around the world. So this is not an exception, as so-called real crime experts already claim blue-eyed again. The whole thing is now not just about the sex-loving mere stranger, but about the male strangers who have been addressed as North Africans and Arabs, because in this relationship everything is wrongly generalized, whereby all Africans and Arabians or other foreigners and immigrants are suspected and denigrated as sex monsters, which is of course absolute idiotic nonsense. The description North African and Arabic is now automatically used again by racists for anti-propaganda against Africans, Arabs and other foreigners and migrants, thus further promoting the prevailing boom of pre-convictions a la neo-Nazis and Pegida, etc. Thus the fear of the foreign man as an unrestrained rapist, becomes a powerful and very dangerous prejudice that is in no way justified. Such feeble-minded assertions and prejudices create a pattern of a sex-loving foreign African, Arab, or generally foreigner and migrant. The racists use it for scaremongering, whereby much of it corresponds to a projection of hatred and unreasonableness, and suggests to the naive and susceptible people that they themselves exercise violence against the Africans, Arabs, other foreigners and the immigrants, etc. But what interests these racists is, on the one hand, only power and money as well as sex, but what they deny and pass it off to others, Africans, Arabs, and all foreigners, strangers and migrants. It makes everything all the more mean and dirty. Thus it can be blamed on the racists that they are no better and just as dirty as the criminals who attacked the women and girls on New Year's Eve in Cologne, and who in reality sexually abuse their own wife, sister, daughter, or niece, or any other foreign woman or girl when it really matters. What is hostile for racists? And for them this means everything foreign, everything of different color, belief, thinking, culture, and appearance, is associated with dangers for them, which must be fought and eradicated. And this can also happen as the mass rapes in wars prove, in which women and girls are brutally and maliciously raped and then possibly murdered. Every racist attitude corresponds to an erroneous, delusional notion in which hidden dangers lurk in relation to sexual rape degeneration. Another fact, however, is that sexual assaults on women and girls can also take place in supposedly safe places. Wherever women and girls go today, they can be attacked and even raped in every respect by a single man or by many men at the same time, without any help from passers-by or police, as the case of Cologne shows. In my opinion, however, the whole thing of what is happening in Cologne goes a great deal further, and everything also interferes with the ruling politics and religions, which also disregard the human rights of the female sex, women and girls, and do nothing to prevent, regardless of work and occupation, culture, social status, and religion, from suffering very profound human rights violations every day and in every country. When talking about human rights, which were defined and recognized as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations General Assembly on the 10th of December 1948, this also refers to the rights of women and girls. And these rights were determined for all men from birth and for every man of every people, race, religion, sect, social class, office, young and old, and for full honor and dignity. But the reality is unfortunately different, because not only the many unjust men around the world disregard the rights of women and girls, but also many employers, civil servants, authorities, legislatures, rulers, religions, sects, and states. Consequently, many women and girls around the world suffer human rights violations and cannot defend themselves against them. Around the world, as you said some time ago, as many female offspring are aborted before birth, or killed as babies as are effectively born. And if I look at today's population that you have given me, in 2015 about 102.5 million human descendants were born, and as many aborted or murdered as babies. I have already said that thousands and thousands of women and girls are also raped in wars, but not yet that children of all ages are sexually abused and then murdered in wars. Statistics also prove that every fifth woman worldwide is threatened, beaten, or sexually abused by her husband. But the whole thing also happens very often in friendships and acquaintanceships. In addition, the religious delusion of circumcision still prevails on Earth, with about 3 million girls and young women being mutilated in their genitals every year. Quite a few die from infections caused by unclean circumcision instruments and ghastly unhygienic behavior, which degenerate to such an extent that many deaths occur. These, too, are human rights violations that have to do with the duties and roles assigned to the female sex in society, by the madmen's world and by idiotic religious cults, rights, behaviors, and regulations that also intervene in the private sphere of women and girls. And the fact that they are completely helpless with regard to their physical and psychological invulnerability to men, and the demands of religious lunacy, and that they have to endure enormous torture, humiliation of all kinds. Neither the guilty men's world nor the religious deep roots and their greasy participants care. The fact is, then, that the female sex, women and girls and even female children are insufficiently or not at all protected by human rights, and that their tormentors and perpetrators of female suffering and pain generally get away with it. Through the adopted human rights, governments would be obliged under international law to prevent all violence against women, girls, and children, but in many cases nothing of the kind is done, so that they can only enjoy weak protection, little protection or no protection at all. To the contrary, the corresponding crimes against them are not prosecuted by law, and the offenders follow suit. That is to say, the offending husbands and other men, and even religious friars, have a disastrous effect with regard to sexual abuse of women and girls, as well as on male and female children as pedophiles. And what happens in this respect in war as well as in peace, in the public and also in the purely private life of those men's world who commit crimes against women, girls and children with regard to sexual abuse and disregard for human rights, beats the bottom of every barrel. Effectively, every righteous man internationally would have to speak out against all this injustice to the female sex and denounce the whole thing in order to put pressure on the male world in the States to do their duty. Unfortunately, however, cowardice is too great even among the majority of righteous men who know and condemn the truth about the unrighteous men who engage in and practice machinations against the feminine sex that disregard human rights. As a rule, it is only women and girls who raise their voices in women's magazines, which are not read by the men's world, and denounce the evil. Or then, it is hateful feminists who rant with their inflammatory speeches against the entire male world, also against the righteous men, and condemn them, which in turn leads counterproductively to this male world defending itself, and so many of them fall away from their friendliness towards women and become women haters. The entire healthy and righteous male world would have to effectively prevent acts of violence of any kind against women, whereby the law would also have to punish such acts extensively, even if the woman or the girls, and children, are beaten in a marriage. In particular, gender-specific acts of violence should also be investigated, and the perpetrators of violence punished. All of this is too lax or not handled at all by law around the world, so there is a need for women, girls, and children to have access to justice and remedies. Much more and much better and actually effective legal structures and corresponding controls and security measures for the protection and support of women, girls, and children affected by violence and sexually endangered must be created and set up effectively, and existing structures of this kind more supported in this respect. This also means that non-governmental male and female actors must work to ensure that something is finally done in general against the everyday violence of every kind against women and girls. Particularly the official and governmental forces are addressed, as especially, however, also the loud-mouthed and allegedly human and woman-friendly and love-preaching religions and sects, as well as common forces of all kinds. The truth is, however, that all these forces have little or no concern for women's rights and human rights, although they all claim that they would do so, in a tone of conviction that it is self-evident for them to do so. Here and there, little of it may be true, but really only little, because the bulk of the whole is just doing and showing. The male domain is still valid, as it has been since time immemorial, and as it was also understood in the French Revolution of 1789, namely that only men must be recognized as legal subjects and have the right to determine. This was also true in Switzerland for almost 700 years, even though it called itself the oldest democracy in the world. Women were politically and in all things not equal and had to cower and duck in front of the men's world in this respect, as in many other areas. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 is designed to apply to all people, including women, girls, and children, so that they can all exercise their rights without discrimination or restriction of any kind. Exactly this is, however, in the whole in various states only a sham, because often the rights of women, girls, and children are simply disregarded, not only by state arbitrary laws, but also in the private sector, where women and girls are paid less and less for the same work, which also men do, and thus exploited in terms of work and sexually coerced under circumstances. This is no wonder, because in politics and in the private sector it is still the male domain that rules, and where female bosses lead the rudder it is generally, with a few righteous exceptions, feminists who, in their greed for power and tyranny, are at least as bad as unrighteous and domineering men. The international and human rights system, however, has been and will continue to be shaped primarily by men who have not been able to muster any sense or understanding of the qualities and realities of women's lives, and who are unable to do so now and probably in the near future. If the life of women between the public and private domain has been considered since time immemorial, then it can be seen that they have always been excluded from the enjoyment of their equal rights vis-a-vis men since birth from the human rights naturally assigned to them, and continue to be largely so today. Only in more recent times, usually from the 20th century onwards, were they slowly granted various rights, but by no means all those which men claim for themselves. It must also be said that human rights violations against women and girls occur primarily in the private sphere, such as in marriage and friendship, but also in economic life. Shamefully, a serious international discussion about this only began in the 1980s, when it was finally considered in civilized and constitutional countries that the state must also have obligations with regard to punishing human rights violations by private individuals. But it took until 1993, when the Vienna World Conference on Human Rights created international agreements, declarations and commitments on violence against women, which unfortunately did not achieve much in terms of the reality of the implementation of women's rights, in terms of extending human rights to private life and the equality of women in public and business. The fact is that women still risk their lives, or at least physical and psychological harm in many places today, if they claim their rights for themselves or generally stand up for them. Genuine and useful human rights relating to parenthood, childbirth, sexuality, and pregnancy are particularly important for women and girls, but in many countries, these rights are completely or partially disregarded. It is also the rule that neither women nor girls are enlightened, do not make free decisions about their own sexuality, and are not free to determine and choose their husbands because they are often victims of forced marriages, discrimination, and violence. And this misery does not end for the women and girls as long as the unrighteous man can exercise and live out his lust for power and rule and abuse, beat up and rape the women as the object of his sexual desires and power allure. Only those women who have a good and righteous husband and those girls who have a good and righteous friend are good.
What you're saying is an undeniable fact. Equality is based on humanism, rooted in the core of respect and dignity of the human being, which corresponds to factors that apply to both the female and male sex, hence to both women and men. Equality corresponds to the equality of all duties and rights for men and women, so there must be no difference. The fact is that all human beings are born free and equal in honor, dignity, and rights. The so-called equal right for all means, among other things, a fundamental human right that personal freedom, honor, and dignity, as well as personal peace, one's own decision-making ability and ability to act must be guaranteed, and this in relation to the female and male sex, respectively, woman and man. Of course, regardless of this, certain rights can be withdrawn from a person if necessary. For example, in the case of demonstrably given immaturity with regard to one's own ability to make decisions and act, but also in the case of delinquency, dependence, need for support, helplessness, powerlessness, independence, lack of freedom, immaturity, dependence, subservience, or bondage. But now, Edouard, I privately have the following to discuss with you. After that, I must go.